Boldwood presents Five French Hens, written by Judy Leigh, and read by Annie Aldington. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Jen held the umbrella over her head and listened to the rain drumming on the canvas. It would be cosy inside the pub. The wind blew hard through the material of her jacket. She'd thought she'd be warm enough, but there was ice in the February gusts that sifted around the corner and lifted her hair, rearranging it across her face. She'd spent the afternoon in the hairdresser's and had been pleased with the glossy style. Silver strands streaked through the chestnut locks. In the grey suit and neat heels, she'd thought she'd look smart, but the cold weather and the sharp breeze had taken the edge off her preparations, and she was sure her nose would glow red beneath the light dusting of powder. But Eddie wouldn't mind. The first thing he always said was how nice it was to see her, and how lovely she looked. There were posters in the windows of the olive grove, huge red hearts and cute cupids with arrows, proclaiming the evening's special Valentine dinner. Jane could hear the hushing of the waves breaking against the sea walls in the distance, and from down the road the crisp sound of approaching footfall. It was Eddie, in his pale mackintosh, the collar up, looking debonair, just like Inspector Morse. It was 7:30 sharp. 7:30, thought Rose. The torture must end soon. Little Amelia's nimble fingers pressed the pristine ivory keys on the piano. The discordant jangle made a pulse in Rose's head throb. "Try again from the beginning, dear," she murmured, watching the second hand twitch on the wall clock. It would soon be over, and Amelia would leave her in peace. Rose sighed and spoke through clenched teeth. "Shall we call it a night, dear? I think Mummy's here. Someone just rang the doorbell, I'm sure." Amelia slammed the piano lid down without turning round and stood up, still in her school uniform, tidy in the crisp white blouse and tartan skirt, her blonde plaits neatly secured with bows. Rose held up the child's coat and led her to the door, where a tall, slim woman with dark hair in a no-nonsense cut and a smart coat was standing in the porch, the rain teeming behind her. Amelia went straight to her and took her hand, a dutiful 6-year-old. But Rose was sure that the child wrinkled her nose and stuck out the edge of her pink tongue at her. Amelia's mother smiled, although her eyes remained cold. "How was Amelia's lesson, Mrs. Grant? She's been practising all week. Is it time for her to be put forward for a grading?" She held out 2 notes, a 10 and a 5. Rose noticed Amelia scowling. She was unsure what to say, her hand fluttering in front of her face. "She's making progress, Mrs. Bassett. Soon, I hope." Amelia's mother frowned. "My friend Sally tells me that Joni Yates puts all her pupils in for grading early. They all seem to pass with distinctions, too." Rose sighed. She wished she could tell the woman to take her child to Joni Yates then, and see how she coped with Amelia, who clearly didn't practice anything from one week to another. But her pupils were becoming scarcer. She had no idea why she didn't just retire. After all, it wasn't as if she needed the money. Bernard had left her comfortably off, and piano teaching was a routine that left her feeling unfulfilled, flat, without energy. "Keep practising for Elisa, Amelia, and maybe we'll discuss grade entry next week." Amelia gazed up at her mother, her tiny brows meeting in a knot. "For Elisa is boring, Mummy. Can I learn the violin instead? Elsa in my class goes to violin. She says the teacher is really cool." Amelia's mother met Rose's eyes, as if her daughter had just made up her mind for her, and turned on her heel, tugging the child towards the pouring rain and a dark car parked by the curb. Rose closed the door, locked it securely with the bolt and chain, and muttered, "Minx." As an afterthought, she mumbled, "What a blessing that Beethoven was deaf. If he'd heard Amelia slaughtering his fur Elisa for the last 45 minutes, it would raise him from the grave." She stood in the hallway, thinking. 7:30. She hadn't eaten since lunch, and then just a slice of toast. She wasn't really hungry, but she ought to look after herself better. Her skirt was hanging off her, the waist baggy, and her legs felt weak. She would find something in the freezer, something with calories. There was a box of macaroni cheese for one. She could heat it up in the microwave. Rose sighed again. She didn't like February. Spring was too far away and the house was too cold. Besides, Bernard had died in February 2 years ago, and each year she felt the cold, haunting loneliness grasp her by the shoulders and whisper in her ear that she was by herself and companionless, and that was how it would always be now. Of course she had her new friends, the 4 women she'd met at aqua aerobics last October when the club first started. They were nice women, but they only met for coffee once a week, and then she came home alone and it was back to the silence again. She shuffled into the lounge and picked up a yellow duster, rubbing it over the piano. It had been hers and Bernard's. He had been a wonderful musician, a church organist too. She replaced their wedding photo lovingly on top, over the circle left by a wine glass, years ago. Not hers, of course. It might have been made by their son, Paul, one Christmas when he'd visited with the children. His visits were a rare thing nowadays. He was a busy man, of course. He had an important job. Rose stared at the photo, black and white in the silver frame. It all looked so dated now. Bernard was in his suit, a flower in the lapel, his hair wavy, a broad grin on his face, and she was much shorter than him, gazing up in the lacy dress, her eyes full of love. That had been in 1967. It was so long ago, and yet strangely she could remember exactly how she'd felt, her heart fluttering, the thrill of becoming Mrs. Grant and not Miss Rosemary Tucker. They'd had almost 50 good years, well, mostly good. She'd done her best as a wife. She couldn't really complain. Rose shuffled forward to the kitchen and opened the freezer. The macaroni cheese meal for one was next to the loaf of bread and the half-empty bag of frozen peas. She'd need to do some shopping. She plucked out the cardboard meal and headed towards the microwave. Della heard the knocking at the door. "Sylvester? You've forgotten your key?" She rushed to the front door, wiping her hands on a tea towel, patting the dark curls smattered with grey sprinklings. "That man," she muttered under her breath. "He's out too late again. His dinner is ruining in the oven." She pulled the door open, and he was standing there, his pork pie hat on his head, water dripping from the brim onto his misted glasses, his lips pursed for a kiss. He held out a bunch of roses. "Come to me, my Valentine," he purred. "Get in out of the rain and stop the foolishness," she laughed, tugging at his sleeve and helping him out of his damp coat. "I wish you'd give up this crazy snack van job. You're late again and drenched through." The flowers were thrust in her arms, and he had her round the waist, waltzing. "Come here, my Valentine girl. I bring you flowers and what you do, but all this nagging me again." Sylvester giggled, kissing her full on the mouth. He pulled away, whipping off his hat. His head was smooth and shiny, but there were tufts of grey whiskers on his chin. Della hugged him to her. "I prepared your favourite, saltfish." "Ah." He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "My mummy's saltfish and ackee. I remember it so well when I was a boy. Life in Jamaica was good before we came to this God-forsaken cold country." They walked into the kitchen, and he sniffed exaggeratedly. "No wonder I married you, Della Donovan. You cook just like my mommy used to." Della turned to him and put her hands on her hips, frowning. "You telling me there are no other benefits, Sylvester?" She swirled away, reaching for a vase, unwrapping the flowers and arranging them carefully. She knew he was studying her, the sway of her hips, the way she moved with a roll. It was the first thing he'd ever noticed about her when they'd met in Stepney 50 years ago. "The flowers are beautiful." He pulled her to him in one expert move, and she was on his knee. "You're beautiful. We eat first, then how about an early night, my Valentine?" She pulled off his glasses and gazed into the soft brown eyes. "You think you're still the man you were at 25? "You put fire in my belly, woman." He put his mouth against hers, crushing their lips together. Della pushed him away, laughing. "Your technique still needs work," she said, grinning. "But you're the sexiest man I ever met, Sylvester." She levered herself up, rubbing a hard hand across the ache that had started to settle in her lower back, and moved awkwardly towards the cooker. "And I've made your favourite ginger cake for pudding. With rum." She lifted a pot from the hot plate, although her wrists ached with the weight of it. Her husband was sitting back in his seat, smiling. "You have a fine figure on you, Della." "I'm not the slim girl I was at 22.
"You are still the same to me."
He lifted his knife and fork and winked at her.
"Come on then. Let's eat first. Afterwards I'll chase you round the bedroom."
She laughed. "I look forward to it. And when you catch me, will you still remember what to do?" Tess stared at her plate. She had no appetite. She'd been on her own all day, cooking, tidying, watching daytime television, looking forward to Alan coming home. But now he was here, and they were sitting across the table from each other. She had nothing to say. The only sound was of Alan chewing, a wet sound, slurping mixed with the snapping of teeth. He had gravy on his chin. She tried a question. "How are the chops?"
"A bit tough, Tess," he mumbled, his fork in the air.
"Oh."
Tess concentrated on her plate. She hadn't started on the chop yet, but it looked all right to her. The potatoes and peas looked fine. She tried again.
"How's the mash?"
He said nothing for a moment, and then shrugged. "Mash is mash." Tess clanked her knife and fork against the porcelain plate, cut the chop and chewed. It seemed tender enough. She gazed at her husband across the linen tablecloth.
"The weather's not good, is it?"
His eyes sparked with sudden interest. "No, it's not. This rain is forecast for the whole weekend. I won't get out on the course if it carries on teeming down. I have a new iron I want to try out. I've been practicing the swing with Cliff's club. I think it might improve my game. Cliff always buys the best for himself. My handicap would improve vastly if I just—" Tess scraped back her chair and stopped listening. She collected his plate, now empty, and took it to the dishwasher.
"Shall I make coffee, Alan?"
Alan frowned, leaning back in the chair and rubbing his portly belly. "If you like, Tess." She felt strands of platinum blonde hair loosen from the clip at the top of her head, and she pushed back the silky skeins.
"I could open a bottle of port if you like."
Alan pressed the black-framed glasses towards his eyes. "Port? Whatever for?"
"It's Valentine's Day," Tess chirped. She'd bought him a card, a blue tie wrapped in tissue paper. They were upstairs next to the bed.
Alan shook his head. "It's just commercial rubbish," he grunted. "I was going to get you some chocolates, but I thought with you being on a diet you wouldn't appreciate it."
Tess looked down at herself, at the baggy pullover and comfy jeans. She didn't remember telling Alan she was on a diet. She thought she was fine. Her waist was a bit thicker than it had been before the children, but she was not bad for her 72 years. She met his eyes. "Do I need to go on a diet?"
He shrugged. "It's an after-Christmas thing, I suppose. You had too much wine and chocolate and cake," he sniffed. "Tess, bring the coffee into the lounge, would you? There's some golf on Sky Sports. I thought I might—" He shoved back his chair and mumbled as he moved towards the door. Tess stared at him. The dark hair, sparse on the top, and sighed as she watched him go. There had been a documentary she'd wanted to watch about a woman who had travelled to Egypt, an archaeologist in search of evidence about the life of Nefertiti.
Tess had wondered what it would be like to travel and research, to go somewhere exotic and interesting. But now she'd have to take her book in the lounge and read, while Alan watched golf and gabbled a ridiculous running commentary on each shot, speaking to himself as he always did. Tess filled the kettle and thought about Nefertiti. She'd been a mysterious and powerful woman in Egypt. Tess was a skivvy in Exmouth to a man who was a slave to golf.
Elvis! Elvis, I'm home!
The black cocker spaniel rushed towards her, his long ears swinging, and leapt up at her knees. Pam reached down and fondled the curly fur on his head.
I haven't been too long, have I, Elvis? I just wanted to do a mile. The weather's awful.
To prove her point, Pam ran her fingers through her hair. The usually blonde spiky cut hung in dark dripping clumps over her face.
A man at the bus stop shouted at me, "You must be bloody mad, woman, running in this weather at your age." I just laughed. But I'm freezing now. I must get out of these jog pants and into the shower. Come on up with me, Elvis. No, I'll feed you afterwards. I promise. I must get this clobber off and get warmed up.
Pam rushed up the stairs, the spaniel bounding behind her. She peeled the damp layers from her body and hurried under the stream of hot water, reaching for soap and lathering herself. Through the steam and the glass, she could see the dark shape of Elvis, sitting patiently on the bath mat, waiting for her. Swathed in a fluffy dressing gown, her feet bare, Pam padded downstairs, Elvis at her heels. In the little living room, the wooden table had been set with one plate, one knife and one fork, and a fire was blazing in the hearth. Pam curled up on the colourful rug, pushing a hand through her hair. Elvis snuggled down next to her legs, placing his wet nose on her lap. She rubbed his head and met the soulful eyes.
"Okay, it's dinner time soon, Elvis."
The spaniel wagged his tail, a steady drumbeat against the rug. She smiled at him.
"I've got some food for you in the kitchen, and I was going to make a nice Buddha bowl for myself, but guess what? I've just remembered. It's Valentine's night. I'll do a pizza and open a bottle of red wine, and afterwards we can both have a treat. Mine's ice cream. What's yours?" Elvis bounded up towards her, his front paws on her chest. The dressing gown sagged open. Pam laughed. "Elvis, really? I know you're the best Valentine I've ever had, but you need to keep your passion under control." She hugged him close, the fire warming her face, and she offered him her wide smile. "I must be the only woman in the world sharing Valentine's night with Elvis. But it has to be said, although you look gorgeous," she kissed his damp nose, "your breath is terrible." Chapter 2. Jen had offered to pay half the bill, but Eddie had insisted. He'd reached for his wallet and taken out cash, winking at her conspiratorially as he added an extra £5 on the silver tray. He'd smiled towards the waiter. "That's for the good service. The pie was particularly tasty, and I'm a great believer in coming back to somewhere if the service is of a good standard." He held up her coat and she slipped it on. "Shall we go, my dear?"
He presented his arm and Jen poked her wrist through the crook of his elbow as they strolled along the path. The rain had stopped, but there was a strong breeze from the seafront, and the street lamps reflected light from neon signs in the puddles. Jen and Eddie turned the corner towards Barley Mow Avenue, where she lived. Jen raised her eyebrows. It was gone 10 o'clock, and Eddie lived half a mile's walk from her house. She turned to face him. "Eddie, you don't need to walk me all the way home. I'd hate you to be caught out in another rainstorm." He chuckled. "It's Valentine's Day. I thought I might get an invite to come in for a coffee." "Oh." Jem frowned. He hadn't been in her house, not yet. He usually walked her to the corner of her road, pecked her cheek and turned away, discreet and polite. But then most of their dates had been lunchtime meetings or strolls on the seafront or an afternoon tea. She'd met him for the first time on Boxing Day. They'd both been wandering on the beach, and he'd started a conversation, invited her to join him for a warm drink in the olive grove, before inquiring where she lived and walking her halfway back. They talked about how quiet it was, being by themselves over Christmas. He was a widower, and he'd invited her for a drink the next day. Then they'd met twice a week for lunch, then recently more frequently. A cream tea, a brisk walk. He was charming, good-looking, good company. But he'd never asked to come in for coffee before. "Oh," Jem repeated. "All right." She wondered what he meant by coffee. He was walking next to her, an impatient roll to his stride as if he was in a hurry. She could smell the tang of his aftershave. He'd clearly sprayed on a good deal more when he'd visited the gents just before they'd left. And he'd combed his hair. Jen thought he was well groomed, smart, suave even, but she hadn't considered the wider implications of coffee. They rounded the corner to Barleymow Avenue, walking at a pace towards her little semi-detached house with the green front door. Jen's thoughts were racing. She had coffee in the kitchen, an instant ground mix in a jar, some decaf at the back of a cupboard. She even had a cafetiere and some Machu Picchu beans. She wondered what sort of coffee Eddie would drink, or if he'd prefer tea. There was an unopened packet of custard cream somewhere too. She glanced up at him, and he winked again. She wondered if coffee mightn't mean something completely different, not coffee at all, but an innuendo, a euphemism for something else. Jen caught her breath. She had no idea what to say to him. She pulled the key from her handbag, opened the front door, and muttered, "Well, what takes your fancy, Eddie?" He raised his eyebrows. "I mean, do you want it hot and strong, sweet, milky, or just as it comes out of the spout?" She felt herself blushing and fluttered her hands in front of her face. "Shall we take our coats off and sit down?" Eddie glanced around the hall, at the thick carpet and velvet door curtain that kept out the draughts. "You keep it nice here, Jen." He sat in the lounge on the sofa, his feet on the rug. His shoes were damp, and Jen wanted to tell him not to get mud on the carpet. He was glancing around the room, taking in the furniture, the books, the photos on the sideboard, her wedding photo with Colin in 1970. Jen was holding a bouquet as if it was heavy, a smiling bride with her long chestnut hair and the flowing white dress. Colin with sideburns and a fringe over his eyes. She retreated to the small kitchen, banging open the cupboard door and clutching a small jar of freeze-dried Costa Rican. Her hand shook as she filled the kettle. It had been a long time since a man had been in her house. There had been no one through the door since Colin had died, and that had been 4 years ago, apart from her brother-in-law Pete, and the young lad who'd serviced the boiler, of course. Jen wondered what Eddie might want to service. The porcelain cup slipped from her grip. She caught it just in time and placed it carefully on the saucer, on top of the tray with the jug of milk and the sugar lumps. Her heart had started to thud. She was not sure whether she was feeling excitement, passion, or just unbridled fear. She'd been married at 23, and before Colin there had just been one boyfriend, Ricky, who she'd loved from the age of 15 until they'd broken up 5 years later, when he'd taken off to a pop festival, met some new friends, and left to find himself on the Isle of Wight. Jen had lost him and herself too for a while. Then she'd met Colin, an assistant in the local fishmonger's shop, and settled for a quiet life. Colin had been promoted to manager. He was a good businessman, buying their house, then purchasing the shop for himself. They'd been comfortable, although it would always be a regret that they weren't blessed with children. Colin had been kind, thoughtful, and she'd never wanted for much. Then he'd had a stroke 4 years ago. He'd lasted 3 months. The second stroke had finished him off. Jen admitted to herself that she'd felt lonely ever since. She missed the warmth of him more than the passion. Colin had been moderate in his desire for her. Her first love, Ricky, had been young, a sloppy kisser and a fumbler of buttons, more interested in his guitar than lust. She'd missed out on it, really. Mad passion. Frantic sex. Sex had never been on her mind much at all. Until now. Eddie had kissed her before, on the cheek at first, then several weeks ago on the lips, briefly, every time they parted. There was warmth in his hugs, but she'd never considered that there might be something else. And now she didn't know what she was feeling. Afraid? Glad to be desired? Perhaps she simply felt happy in his company. She wasn't sure. She carried the tray into the lounge, her breath a little ragged. Eddie had taken off his jacket and loosened his tie. She put the tray down, and he patted the seat next to him, grinning.
Jen, come and sit here. The coffee can wait a minute, can't it?
She wondered why her legs were being so obedient as she moved to the sofa and plonked herself down next to him, her shoulder against the arm he had draped across the back of the seat. His grasp circled her, and he pulled her next to him.
Jen.
He pecked her cheek.
Jenny.
She wondered whether to sit up straight, wriggle away, feign a sudden interest in conversation and start gabbling about the lounge carpet, the deep pile, and the difficulties of finding a good hoover, one that would pick up all sorts of dust and get into the tricky corners. He nuzzled her cheek, his lips against her ear. Jen closed her eyes. The sensation wasn't unpleasant. She inhaled the heady cinnamon and musk scent of his aftershave and wondered if he would kiss her. He pecked her on the lips and she blinked. He was staring at her, his blue eyes huge, his tidy grey hair framing a handsome face, his lips pursed to speak.
Jen.
She wondered what would come next. The excitement and trepidation had turned into puzzlement. Eddie, your coffee will get cold.
I haven't come here for the coffee, Jen.
He moved his face closer to hers.
I ought to tell the truth. It was a ploy to get you here alone, just us, by ourselves.
Jen felt her heart bump. She was thrilled, intrigued. He was going to kiss her, perhaps tug at her clothes. Her mind raced. She had known him for 2 months. She liked him a lot. But what if it wasn't passion on his mind? What if he intended to steal from her, or worse? She did trust him, though. His face was serious and kind. He surely couldn't be a serial killer. But she'd read about such people in the papers, making widowed ladies trust them, and then... No, surely not Eddie. His eyes were full of kindness.
I wanted to say something, Jen. I mean, we get along well.
She caught her breath. He was going to tell her that he wanted to end the relationship. They got along well, but that was all there was to it. She was expecting too much of him, a widower set in his ways. Jen shook her head. No, it wasn't that. He'd taken her out on Valentine's night. Perhaps he was going to confess that he'd fallen for her, that he was in love. Then perhaps he'd rip open his shirt, fall on top of her, and sink his lips against her neck. Jen exhaled. She'd been reading too many romance novels. She reached out, patted his hand in an encouraging way. What is it, Eddie?
When we met on Boxing Day, we talked about how difficult it was being alone. You lost your husband. My wife Pat passed away 2 years ago. I've never become used to being by myself, to tell you the truth.
He must be miserable, Jen thought. His face was serious, his eyes those of a lost puppy. She patted his hand again. How can I help, Eddie?
We get on, don't we?
He'd suddenly become breathless. His words rushed.
I mean, we like each other. Jen, we're not young. There's no time like the present. Not a second to waste.
He fumbled in his pocket, his face flustered, his lips open, panting. Jen wondered what he was searching for. An inhaler? Her eyes widened. She was astonished. He pulled out a handkerchief, unwrapping the neat folds, and held something out towards her. It was a ring. 3 diamonds in a row on a gold band. An antique style.
Jennifer Hooper, would you do me the honour?
She frowned, unsure what he wanted.
The thought flicked into her mind that he was trying to sell it to her. Perhaps he had money problems. "Eddie? Will you marry me?" She gasped, falling back into the sofa against the soft cushions. She didn't know what to say. Her mind was blank, waiting for the flood of emotions that would follow. "Me? You're asking me?" He grasped her hand, holding the ring up, sliding it onto the wedding finger. It was a little loose. "It fits well. Real diamonds, the best money can buy. So, would you do me the honour of becoming my wife?" Jen was aware that she hadn't said yes. Not yet. But he was right. It was a good idea. They were both in their 70s. Jen was 73 and Eddie a little older. They were both alone, widowed. Neither of them liked solitude. And Eddie was a nice man, dapper, suave, well-dressed, and pleasant company. Thoughts were rushing, crashing against each other in her mind. It would be good to have someone there when she woke up. Someone to share meals with, to talk to share the warmth of an embrace. And he was such a nice man, so caring, so considerate. She'd be mad to refuse. But it had happened so quickly she couldn't catch her breath. In some ways, Eddie was still a stranger. She'd only known him since Boxing Day. They'd been on pleasant dates and enjoyed each other's company. He was courteous, kind, always complimenting her, offering her his arm as they strolled along the beach. It fluttered into her head that he was nothing like Colin, her Colin, whom she'd known so well, who had fitted her married life like a comfortable sock, who had become such an essential part of the fabric of her life that she knew every stitch. Eddie was unknown to her, a fit that wasn't yet snug. "What do you say, Jen? Will you be Mrs. Bruce? Will you accept?" An expression of confusion etched itself across her face. Her fingers shook. The ring was loose on her wedding finger. She stared at Eddie. "I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. It's early days yet. Can I think about it?" He slid the ring from her finger and held it in his open palm, meeting her eyes with his serious blue ones. "Of course. Take as long as you need. But neither of us is getting any younger." He pressed his lips against hers. They were cool. When he pulled away, he seemed composed. "Just let me know when you're ready, Jen. You know I'll wait for you to decide." Jen nodded energetically. "All right, Eddie?" He glanced around the house. "You've made it so nice here. A feminine touch. But of course I could tidy it up a bit, you know. I'm good with DIY. Jen nodded again. She wasn't sure what to say. It was as if a whirlwind had lifted her up. She was buoyant and moving out of control. Her limbs had gone numb. Her lips, too. She could only nod. Eddie eased himself upright. "Well, I'll get off now, shall I? Perhaps we can meet tomorrow and we can talk about it again when you've had time to give it some thought. It's a good offer, my dear. What do you say, Jen?" She stood up, facing him. Yes, all right. I'll think about it." He kissed her lips lightly again. "Well, that's it. Do take it seriously, though. You and I are very good together. We make a good couple, and we'd make each other very happy." He reached for his coat, tugging it over broad shoulders. Jen blinked, then fussed with his collar, fidgeting with the buttons. "Are you going home now, Eddie?" "It's 11 o'clock, he said, smiling. "I need my beauty sleep. You too." He lifted her chin. "Well, you just need sleep." He shuffled towards the door. Jen wondered if she should invite him to stay. She wanted company. She wanted him to hold her tight, to kiss her properly. He hadn't said he was in love with her yet. "You wouldn't like to stay? A bit longer?" He pecked her cheek again. "I'll phone you tomorrow and we can meet for afternoon tea." He put a finger to her face. "What a wonderful evening this has been. It's so nice to spend time with you. I just thought it would be lovely if our arrangement was a bit more permanent." Jen nodded. She wondered if she should have said yes, if her refusal had made Eddie's feelings cooler towards her. He kissed her cheek and put an affectionate arm around her. She clung to him, but he eased himself away. "It'll be cold outside. I'll see myself out. I don't want you to catch a chill. Good night, my dear." And then he was gone. Jen squeezed her eyes closed, not sure if she was disappointed, in love, or just confused. All three, perhaps. But she would have liked him to stay. She'd have enjoyed more conversation and a sense of closeness. Then perhaps she would be sure she loved him. She'd know if she should have accepted his proposal. But there was always tomorrow. She was suddenly filled with a thrill about the future and what it might bring. She picked up the tray. The coffee was untouched, but it had gone cold. Jen sighed. She'd wash up, tidy a little, and then she'd go to bed, alone. She gazed at her finger where the diamond ring had stayed for almost a minute. She'd had the chance to become an engaged woman, a bride-to-be. It had felt strange, frightening, and just a little bit exciting. She wasn't sure what she'd tell her friends at aqua aerobics, that Eddie had proposed and she turned him down. The room was cold, and Jem was alone. For a moment, she imagined that Eddie was her husband, that they'd finished cups of cocoa and they were on their way upstairs to bed. He'd take her small fingers in his large hand and they'd go up together. Jen suddenly felt a chill in the air, and she realised how lonely she was. Rose played for Elisa again, perfectly. Her fingers drifted easily over the piano keys, and the sound of the music flowing, confident and loud, was somehow reassuring. She finished with a flourish, sat back and looked at her hands. Small, neat, well-shaped, a single gold band on her left hand. She still missed him, Bernard, especially at this time of night, although there had been times he'd annoyed her and they'd bickered. But it was too late for feelings of regret. She had no one to be annoyed with now, and that made her sad. When the last vibration of the piano had faded, it was replaced with empty silence, and she felt cold and alone. Rose stood up from the piano stool. She'd throw away the half-eaten macaroni cheese, wash the plate, and go up to bed. Della lay on her back, listening to the nasal rattle of her husband, Sylvester, who was sleeping by her side, his glasses still perched on his nose. It was his usual nightly practice to snore, an adenoidal snort that lasted for 15 seconds, stopped and then started up again, like a chainsaw. Della smiled. She waited through the silence, the 7 seconds respite, counting him down, and then, bang on time, he started again, the persistent wheeze assaulting her ears again. She reached over, patting his shoulder lovingly. "Sylvester! Sylvester! Stop snoring and go to sleep now, will you, my love?" He paused, and then mumbled through soft lips. "Love you too." Della grinned. She breathed out, rolled over, tugging the duvet with her, and snuggled down into the cocoon of warmth. She closed her eyes, sighed, and started to drift. 7 seconds of blissful silence. The chainsaw rattle began again, stretching out into a 15-second rumble, pausing for 7 seconds, then starting up all over again. It was past 11 now, and Alan was still watching golf. He was still making comments aloud, analysing each whack of the ball, the angle of each curve on the air, the descent towards each hole. Tess clenched her teeth, as if she'd be interested. She'd recorded the documentary about Nefertiti. She'd watch it tomorrow, when Alan was out with his other golf buddies, after he'd left in his jacket and ridiculous cap, carrying his bag of clubs to the car. Tess groaned. The television screen illuminated his face and his eyes shone with happiness. She didn't care. She had her friends,
her own thoughts. She picked up his teacup, the plate she'd put the biscuits on, and took them through to the kitchen to wash up, avoiding his eyes. As she passed him, he gave a little grunt of thanks. She washed the dishes, staring out of the kitchen window. The sky was dark blue, dotted with shining specks of stars. The moon slid behind a cloud and emerged again, a pale silver hook. Tess felt very small inside her quiet house, with no sound except for the dripping tap in the kitchen and the rattle of the television from the next room. She shook her head sadly and told herself again that she didn't care what Alan did. She'd carry on trying to make her own life fun, as she always did, just for herself. It was one of those precious moments that could be held still, like a scoop of fresh water in cupped hands, and treasured. A second of pure peace, followed by another. Elvis was curled up at the bottom of the bed, and soothing music from the smart speaker filled the room, the gentle melodic voice of Enya. Pam closed her eyes and thought of woodlands, leaves draping their tips in gurgling streams, the sunlight filtering through branches. She reached down to stroke Elvis's soft fur and felt a damp nose, the wetness of a tongue. She breathed out, grateful for the warmth of a thick duvet and the intense burning of her toes against a hot water bottle. The past was in the distance. The present was all that mattered. Life, she decided, was good. How could anything be simpler and better than this? Jen woke early in the morning. Her eyes immediately opened wide, and she listened. She sat upright in bed, her heart pounding. She'd heard a noise downstairs. She held her breath. The digital alarm said it was almost 7 o'clock. She listened harder, her ears straining against the silence. There it was again. A soft bump, like a footfall. It had come from the living room. Jen breathed out imperceptibly. It hadn't come from outside. It wasn't the soft gliding of a milk float. There hadn't been one in the street for years, or the heavy rumble of the bin men's lorry. It had sounded like someone bumping against furniture. It was a burglar. Jen called out, "Who's there?" The fear in her own voice made her tremble. She slid out of bed and reached for a dressing gown, pulling it over her nightie. Somehow a second layer made her feel safer. She edged to the top of the stairs, her feet barely touching the carpet. She held onto the banister, supporting each step she took. At the bottom of the stairs, the front door was locked. She'd locked it last night after Eddie had left. Jen listened. Empty silence rang in her ears. And then the noise came again, a brief brushing sound, once. "Who's there?" Her voice was a little stronger, but her legs were trembling. She edged towards the door, pushed it open slowly, and turned the corner into the living room. Her heart leapt as she saw a hunched shape and a pair of green eyes narrowing in her direction. "Gus!" Jen glanced from the black and white cat to the open curtains. She'd left the top window open, and the neighbour's cat had clambered through. She blew air from her mouth in relief as Gus scuttled towards the front door to be let out. She turned the key and opened the door, watching him rush out into the quiet street. Jen decided she needed to settle her nerves. She'd make herself a cup of strong tea. Perhaps she'd have toast and marmalade. She sank onto the sofa and put her head in her hands. She'd left a window open. It was a small gap, but a burglar could have easily crawled through into her home. She was by herself, vulnerable, prey to all sorts of dangerous people. At once, she wanted Eddie to hold her in his arms, to pull her to him and tell her she was safe. If he'd been there, she wouldn't have been so afraid. He'd have stood up to a burglar. He'd have been strong. It was suddenly crystal clear. She loved Eddie. She needed him. They should be together. Not only would she be safer, but she wouldn't be alone. It made complete sense. Eddie was right. She knew it. He was sensible. He was just what she needed in her life. Stability, comfort. Jen took a breath. She knew what she had to do, and at once. She reached for her mobile and dialed his number. Eddie answered almost immediately, his voice a crackle, concerned and reliable.
"Jen, it's 7:30. Are you all right, my dear?"
"Yes." That was the word she wanted to say.
Jen was breathing rapidly. Yes, Eddie. I've never been better. And if you want to ask me again, that's my answer. Yes. He was quiet for a moment, and then he chuckled softly. Are you saying you'll marry me, Jen? Really? Well, that's wonderful news. She was smiling, her face stretched with happiness and relief. The warmth in his tone told her she'd made the right decision. Eddie, yes, I'm sure. Excellent. This calls for a celebration. Can you meet me in the cafe on the seafront? Coffeelicious. It opens at 9. I'll buy you breakfast. Jen nodded, her heart pounding. She realised Eddie couldn't hear her, so she added, Yes, 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 and beamed again at the sound of the word. Oh, then I'll see you soon, my dear, Eddie whispered, and I'll bring the ring along, shall I? Chapter 3. The 5 women emerged dripping from the pool, their skin tingling from the exercise. They formed a line unintentionally, 5 different heights and shapes wearing 5 different colours. Tess Watkins, blonde hair tied back in a little plait, was short and curvy in a turquoise blue tankini. Rose Grant, her grey-brown hair almost black, now drenched with water, was in a sensible navy blue swimsuit, neat and tidy. Della Donovan clambered out next, shapely in an orange floral swimsuit, her frosted dark curly hair glistening with pearl droplets of water. Then the smallest of the 5, Jen Hooper, her shoulder-length chestnut hair clipped to her head, wet tendrils dripping, her body slender and delicate in a cream swimsuit. Finally, towering over them all, Pam Marshall stood tall and willowy in a racerback black swimsuit with blue and red stripes down one side. With her blonde pixie cut flattened against her head and her hands on her hips, she was athletic and broad-shouldered. The friends giggled together, shaking water from tired limbs, moving towards the changing rooms, water dripping from their swimsuits. Tessie's voice rose over the laughter. Well, Cathy certainly made us work hard today. I think we deserve some refreshment. Who's up for a coffee and a slice of cake? Rose nodded. It was better than being home alone. Pam breathed out. I'm gasping for a cool drink. I'm not surprised. Tessie's voice was mock indignant. You were doing aqua aerobics for the 5 of us today. I'm worn out. Della puffed air from her mouth. It was hard work. It's supposed to help the aches in my bones, but I'm exhausted. I thought it was meant to be gentle exercise. Pam snorted. Exercise should never be gentle. It's like life. We should throw ourselves in, give it 100%, grab it by the balls. Jen's face was thoughtful as she linked her fingers together and glanced at the new ring. Tess hooted. I can think of better balls to grab. She flicked water from her platinum hair. Did you see the young man with the dark hair and the broad chest at the other end of the pool? Tight white Speedos, just like Patrick Duffy in The Man from Atlantis. Remember him, girls? Della chuckled. Oh, yes, he was very handsome. She nudged Pam, rolling her eyes. But shouldn't you be thinking about Alan's balls, Tess? Alan knows where he can stick his balls, and his golf clubs. Tess and Della turned to each other, howling with laughter. Rose's eyes were etched with concern. That's a terrible thing to say about your husband, Tess. It may be, but it's true. That man is driving me mad. They were in the changing rooms, sorting through their sports bags. Tess picked up her towel, flinging it around her shoulders. Alan's at golf. I'm out with my friends, free and having fun. I'm going to start by enjoying an invigorating shower. Then I'm having a massive slice of cake. Pam turned to Jen, who was standing next to her, fidgeting with her hands. Are you okay? You're quiet today, Jen. Jen was distracted. Oh, sorry. Yes, I'm fine. She forced a giggle. I'm looking forward to something sweet and tasty in the cafe. Tess squealed. I bet. Are you still going out with that handsome man you met on the beach? Freddie or Eddie, or wherever he is? Jen nodded, twisting the ring on her finger. She reached for her towel and smiled. The table in the cafe was a mess.
Rose wouldn't have allowed the polished wooden one in her dining room to get in such a state. Tess covered her lips as she smiled. There were cake crumbs, paper wrappings, slops of coffee across the plastic surface. She imagined Alan's face if he came home and their oak table was in such a state of disarray. Della swept crumbs into her hand. Pam was more concerned with finishing the contents of a second bottle of sparkling water, and when she dumped the empty container back on the table, it toppled over on its side, spattering little puddles in its wake. Rose wondered if Pam's house was as untidy. She supposed since Pam had always been single, as far as she knew, no one had been around to complain about untidiness. But then, Pam had never had anyone to keep the house nice for either, she thought. Jem was unusually quiet, staring at her fingernails. Della dabbed her mouth with a paper napkin and dropped it on her plate. "That was such good cake. Nearly as good as I make myself." Pam sank her teeth into her slice. "We deserve a treat." She thought for a moment. "It's a shame we haven't got a bottle of wine or two. I haven't had a good celebration in ages." "Are you thinking of a girls' night out?" Tess chewed at her fingernail. "What a lovely idea. We could all get dressed up, go somewhere nice." "Dancing," Della suggested. "Clubbing," Tess offered. "There are some really great places for a rave-up in Exeter." "Rave-up?" Pam spluttered, wiping her mouth. "What decade are you in, Tess?" Tess winked. "I don't care as long as there are plenty of drinks flowing and some fun to be had." Rose pulled a thoughtful face. "What about a birthday? Who's next? I'm not until December." "A girls' night out would be fab." Pam drummed her fingers on the table. "Do we need an excuse?" "We could just go out and party, without any excuse at all," Della chuckled. Jen took a breath. It was time. This was her cue. She held out her left hand to reach for a slice of cake, wiggling her fingers exaggeratedly. Light caught the diamonds and they winked, shooting flashes of rainbow colour. Della sat up straight. "What's that on your finger, girl?" 3 voices trilled at the same time. Tess leaned forward. "Oh my God, no! Tell me she hasn't." Della sighed. "It's a diamond ring. How beautiful!" Pam screeched. "When did that happen?" Jen's face broke into a wide smile. She couldn't hold back. 2 days ago? Valentine's night. Eddie asked me, and the next day I said yes." Rose frowned. "It's a bit quick, isn't it? You've only known each other since Christmas. It takes me longer than that to decide which cut to get at the butcher's." "I think it's lovely," Tess breathed. She was thinking of the emptiness of her own life when Alan was at golf, and how the walls held cold silence in them every day. "Congratulations." Pam banged a fist on the table. "Well, here's our excuse for a night out." Della grabbed Jen's hand. "What a wonderful ring. The diamonds are huge. Where did you buy it, Jen?" Jen waved a hand for all to examine. "Eddie chose it. He just sprang it on me. He came in for coffee." "Coffee?" Della laughed. "I bet he did," Tess snorted. "And he asked me to marry him and produce the ring. Of course I did the sensible thing and asked for more time to think about it." She wiggled her finger again. "Then the next morning I said yes, and Eddie took me to breakfast to celebrate. It was really lovely." Pam leaned back in her seat, stretching out long legs in jeans. "Well, how exciting! Congratulations, Jen. So, when's the big day?" Jen giggled. "We've been talking about it. Eddie thinks we should get married in 6 weeks or so. Late March, early April. A spring wedding." "I hope we're going to be your bridesmaids," Tess butted in. "Oh, we'll probably just have a simple do. No fuss. A few friends. You're all invited, and a quiet meal somewhere. Probably the Olive Grove. Eddie wants us to live in my house. He said he can rent out his place and we'll get a good income from it. He's written all the figures down on a piece of paper." "He sounds like a sensible man." Rose thought for a moment.
But there's no fun in maths. What about the exciting bits, like the honeymoon? Pam fluffed her short hair, making it stand up. Eddie certainly sounds like he has it all worked out. And how do you feel, Jen? Della leaned forward. Are you all excited? It's like being caught up in a whirlwind. Tess grimaced. Oh, yes. It's like that at first. All lovey-dovey. Then after a year or so, it's smelly socks to wash, and the chops are a bit tough, Tess, and golf clubs in every corner of the room. She noticed Jen's anxious expression and laughed too high. Oh, but that's just Alan. I'm sure your Eddie'll be completely different. Does he snore? Della asked, wrinkling her brow. Jen pouted. I've no idea. We haven't, You haven't sampled the goods yet? Tess giggled. Is that a good idea? Eddie's very proper and respectful, Jen insisted. We talked about a honeymoon, a long weekend in Lyme Regis. We'll wait until then. Oh, I'd want to know he was man enough for the job before I married him, Tess winked. Della's face was serious. I think you're all missing the point. She met everyone's eyes in turn. Then she smiled at Jen. It's a wonderful thing. Our friend Jen is getting married, and we should all rejoice for her. Rose nodded. Yes, congratulations, Jen. 2 years of happiness, Pam murmured. I'll drink to that, Tess nodded. And that means a party. Have you met him, Tess? Pam and Tess were walking home together. It was well past 5, and the light was fading already, the sky streaked with indigo and crimson wheels. The two women lived several streets away, and it was their habit to walk home briskly together after aqua aerobics and put the world to rights. But today there could only be one topic. No, but Jen seems very taken with him. I've never set eyes on him. Have you? Yes. Pam took a breath. I was out with Elvis, jogging on the beach, a couple of weeks ago. They were walking along in the other direction, arm in arm. I stopped to say hello, and Jen introduced me. Tess wrinkled her nose. What's he like? Handsome, mid-70s. A tall man, broad-chested, well-mannered. Pam shrugged. I can see why Jen would like him. He seemed very protective, you know? The sort of old-fashioned gentleman type who wraps a woman in cotton wool. She thought for a moment. Somehow she had sensed all this within moments of meeting Eddie. He didn't seem to like Elvis much when he leapt up at him. He seemed more concerned with his expensive coat. I had to carry on with my jog pretty quickly after that. Tess increased her pace to keep up with Pam. They were going up a steady hill. I'm amazed how fit you are, Pam, at 73. Jogging, yoga, swimming. You never stop. You're just amazing. I believe that we either use it or lose it, Pam grinned. It's not all plain sailing. I have aching knees sometimes and a sore heel most mornings. I love to get out, though, in the fresh air. Elvis loves it too. It's too cold for me, Tess shivered. Alan's happy to be out in the winter chill, though. He's moody as anything when he can't play golf. And as for me, I'm glad to...